Now, certainly one of the most powerful positions in the world has a name. It's a four-letter word, and it's Pope. And the Pope, who resides in Rome, is the leader of the largest religious organization in the world. That organization is called the Roman Catholic Church. It has somewhere between 900 million to 1 billion people, which means, nominally, 1 out of every 6 people on this planet. Are you getting this number? All right. Nominally, 1 out of every 6 people on this planet is a member of, or attached to, or connected to in some way the Roman Catholic Church. No other denomination can make that statement. Not 900 million, not 1 billion. If you talk about the Muslims, it isn't a single denomination. There's Sunnis and Shiites and Sufis and Christianity is the largest organized religion in the world. It's not a denomination. It consists of many denominations. All right. There are over 2 billion Christians in the world, meaning 1 out of every 3 people in the world is nominally Christian, although if you're looking at behavior, no. I'm talking about, if you ask them what you are, that's what they'll answer. 1 out of every 3, which means 1 out of every 2 in the Christian world is Roman Catholic. So it's a very powerful church, and it's a very, very powerful position. Now, the present holder of that position has had the position since April of 2005, since the death of John Paul II. So he has been in power in that role for somewhere a little over 2 years. His name, or his papal name, is Benedict the 16th. And Benedict the 16th is ethnically German. He comes from a place in Bavaria. He comes from southern Bavaria. He spent a lot of time, or a good part of his life, or early life, in a town on the Danube called Regensburg. Almost from the very beginning, he wanted to be a priest. I mean, today, before somebody can figure out his major. Do you understand? It takes a long time. He decided very early, I think at the age of 5, he said to his mother, when the Archbishop of Munich was driving by, and he saw the red costume, he said, "I want to be a cardinal." No. So, but in order to get there, you have to start someplace else. So he started out with the priesthood, and from the beginning, he's very smart. He became an intellectual in the church. That was his role. He was not a parish priest. He went off to the universities, and ultimately he graduated with superior degrees, and he ended up teaching at one of the most prestigious universities in Germany, the University of Tübingen, where he was certainly a professor of theology and Catholic studies. He left Tübingen during the great turmoil of the 60s and 70s. Do you remember the turmoil? All right. He had difficulty dealing with the radicalism of the student body, and he withdrew. He went to Regensburg, and he stayed there for a while until he was appointed the Archbishop of Munich, a very important and prestigious place in the Catholic world. So he remained the Archbishop of Munich until he was recruited to come to Rome. He came to Rome to serve John Paul II, and he had a very special role. His role was the Grand Inquisitor. There's something now called the Holy Office. It used to be called the Inquisition. The purpose of the Inquisition is to make sure that everybody in the church is behaving. And in fact, that false doctrines are not being circulated by teachers, lay people, priests, whatever. And in fact, the Inquisition has been in existence since the early Middle Ages. I mean, it exists in other places, in other countries, in other forms. We certainly, after World War II, had an Inquisition, didn't we? During the era of anti-communism, where, in fact, our ideas were checked for their conformity to what was appropriate. And he was much admired and respected by John Paul II. In fact, when John Paul II died, it was fairly clear from the role he played at the funeral that he most likely was the designated, there can't be any official designated successor, but that he was a kind of unofficial designated successor to the role. I mean, one of his drawbacks was that he was German, and still after World War II that was a controversial identity, in particular since he spent his childhood under Hitler. And the second was his age, which I didn't think was a problem. I mean, the nerve. Just because he was 79. What? 79. The youth group. But they didn't consult me. All right, so. But it was a problem. How long would he last? Whatever. So now many people regarded him like John the 23rd regarded him as a kind of an interim person. Maybe he was chosen in that way. He doesn't see himself as an interim person. He is the leader of this church, and while he has power, and I want to tell you about his power, I mean, after all, the Roman Catholic Church is present, dramatically present in all of Europe. Did I say 1 out of every 2 Christians is Roman Catholic nominally? Well, if you exclude North America, then the Protestant population is lower in Europe. So is it 5/8, 3/4? Not including Russia, all right? Not only that, the whole continent of South America, the whole southern half of North America. South of the Sahara, most likely 1/2 of all the Christians who are there, and almost all the Africans south of the Sahara are Christian, are Roman Catholic. And then we have the presence of Roman Catholicism in Asia, the Philippines, Vietnam, South Korea. And then in the North America, north of the Rio Grande, the largest religious denomination, organized denomination in the United States of America, numbering somewhere close to 50 million, is the Roman Catholic Church. So, it's universal all over the world. There certainly is power, and there is prestige, and there is influence. We can see that because one of the important things that President Bush felt that he must do is to visit just recently, to visit the Pope. However, despite the power of the position, the prestige of the position, he has problems. So I'm going to mention some of the problems. One of them in particular I'm going to focus on this morning. The first is his predecessor. His predecessor was a media star, right? John Paul II went out almost from the very beginning. He traveled around the world. There was almost no nation in the world that he did not visit. He came and hundreds of thousands of people showed up to hear him, to see him, to experience him. There were millions, if not billions of people outside of the Roman Catholic Church who regarded him as a moral and spiritual leader. In fact, modern scientific technology was able to send his message and his presence all over the world and to transport him personally all over the world. Well, Benedict XVI, you may have noticed, is not a mediaster. I mean, he speaks nicely. He certainly is articulate. He certainly is brilliant. But he's not John Paul II. And almost from the very beginning, people were making invidious comparisons. He handles it very well by saying, John Paul II was a saint and I'm not. But it's a kind of problem, because once you get used to that kind of leadership, then certainly in troubled times it would be nice to have a continuation of that kind of leadership. One of the problems he has in his church is that he has two groups of people that are giving him a headache. Back in 1962, John the 23rd called the Vatican Council II. And Vatican Council II totally transformed the character and the structure and the ceremonial life to some degree of the Roman Catholic Church. And now the church is divided. There are millions and millions of Catholics all over the world, many of them in Latin America, in Africa, and in Asia, who say that council was a disaster. Let's go back to what was before. They were called, or they are called, the traditionalists. One of them, you know, he's a famous movie star. His name is Mel Gibson. And he doesn't stand alone. There are millions of people, most not quite as radical as he or his father, but they don't like Vatican Council II. They think the church is being ruined. The church is now filled with all these loud-mouthed liberals who keep telling the Pope why they're not obeying him. Well, I like point one, Benedict, but I don't like point two. Well, thank you. I like the Mass, but I don't like birth control, so that's it. I choose one, but not. What are you talking about? What has happened to this organization? I mean, if you denied the sacraments to every person who comes to the Mass in Europe and North America who practices birth control, you most likely would have two people. Do you understand? Two people standing up here. Unless they were lying. So traditionalists give him a headache, and quite frankly, Benedict XVI, as the Grand Inquisitor, while he was serving John Paul II, was often sympathetic to the arguments presented by the traditionalists. He could see some of the chaos that has emerged in the church. But then he has the liberals who say, well, Vatican Council II didn't go far enough. The reason why we don't have any priests is because we don't allow the men to marry. And we don't allow women to serve as priests. If we allowed the men to marry and women to serve as priests, the seminaries would be crowded. How does this organization plan to exist without priests? I mean, the fundamental celebrations of this church can only be done by priests. Go find them. I mean, the church is desperate. They put billboards up on Woodward. Do you remember? Advertising for students, right? I mean, in the history of the priesthood, that was new. So, the liberals are saying we have to move further. We have to give women more power in the church. We have to give the local bishops more power, the local priests more power. We have to allow men to get married. Do you understand this whole thing? And they're screaming at each other. In fact, Vatican Council II unleashed all this trouble. And then, of course, I mentioned already the most important problem. You can't do anything in the church without priests. The way the church is structured, the ideology is presented, the priest is essential. And today, you can't find men who want to be students for the priesthood. Is there anybody in this audience who would like to? I don't know. Virtually nobody. St. John's, which was out in Plymouth, this gorgeous facility which was built by Cardinal Mooney, which was filled with dozens of students when I was younger, is now a catering establishment and a hotel. The whole operation was moved to Chicago Boulevard. No students. So, aging priests, they're going to have to give them operations. I mean, they're going to have to keep them going. So whatever plans you have to understand the contrast between the Roman Catholic Church and one of its rivals, which I will talk about next week, the Protestant evangelicals. Every time I go to the airport, there are at least 20 of them waiting to get on a plane to go to Ecuador, Colombia, whatever it is. Do you understand? To convert. It's a major crisis in the church that nobody has adequately addressed. But the major problem confronting Benedict XVI is right around the Vatican. He is in Europe, the motherland of the church, where the capital of the church, Rome, is. You would imagine that in the motherland of the church, I mean, Africa is not the motherland of the church, Asia is not the motherland of the church, Latin America is not the motherland of the church, Europe is. In Europe, in Italy, in Spain, in France, in all these countries, in Austria, the laity would be going to the church. They are not. So what's the point of having priests if nobody shows up? And the crisis is so bad that Benedict XVI himself has articulated the enemy. What are these people doing? Well, I'll tell you what they're doing. I don't know everything they're doing. They're shopping. They're dancing. They're going to cultural events. They are exercising as everybody is what? Exercising, exercising, exercising. They're traveling. They're doing lots of things. Some of them are even choosing to work. But they're not going to church. Now, anybody who remembers the Roman Catholic Church only 50 years ago in Europe or in North America will be absolutely astonished or appalled by that piece of news. There has been a dramatic decline in the attendance of Roman Catholics in their churches. So, you don't have to worry about the priesthood. No. I mean, if nobody shows, then all you need is the custodian. It's a crisis in Europe, the motherland of the church. It's true in Rome. You can go as a tourist. As a tourist, they take you to all the great churches. And when you arrive at the churches, at around service time, you will find small groups of people, much older than we are. Small groups of people, do you understand, that are there. Most of them are women. Where are the young people that used to go? Where are they? What's happening in Rome? Something wrong with the drinking water? They're not there. In fact, most of the time I was in Rome last year. All the visits to the churches, often at the time when masses were being celebrated, featured hordes of tourists, all photographing each other. They're hoping to photograph a congregation or something like that. No, they photograph each other because there are 1,800 tourists on that side, and there are 2,000 tourists on this side, and there's not much room, so you're photographing each other. Okay, fine. I have great pictures of tourists. Is it a problem? It's the basic problem. The problem of priests doesn't mean anything if nobody is coming to the service, participating. All this grandeur, all these buildings, all this structure, all this history. You're only as good as your latest presentation. No, you can't chew, you can't digest history. So, I think most people, when they think of the church, are somewhere off in the Middle Ages, or maybe the earlier part of the 20th century. Something very dramatic is happening. And in fact, there is now the controversy within the church about what needs to be done. The traditionalists say, I told you, you started this thing, the Vatican Council II, you opened the door, and now look what's happened. And liberals say, well, you didn't do enough, that's why. Now, to understand what's going on, I have to tell you about the foundation of this church. I mean, it's old and venerable. The foundation of the church rests on four things. First of all, the message. The message of the church attributed to Jesus of Nazareth. The message of the church was very simple. It had something to offer, and still offers it, that everybody wants. How do we defeat death? as one grows older, this issue becomes more obvious, more intense, but it has always been the great anxiety of humanity. And in fact, the message was very clear. For those who seek it, and for those who are willing to do what is necessary, it is possible to achieve immortality in a wonderful place. And attached to that, of course, historically was that if you do not choose to follow the path, you can end up with immortality in a horrible place. So, the message was, God took on the form of the human body in the form of Jesus of Nazareth. And then, having suffered a terrible death in which he took upon himself the sins of humanity, he rose. That's the immortality, it's the resurrection. Actually, in the Christian calendar, Easter is much more important than Christmas, even though Christmas has become much more important than Easter. He rose from the dead and became the role model of what? Resurrection, immortality. You too can be resurrected to eternal life. Now, I want to tell you that you can't understand the church without the message. That's how it grew. The second thing was the organization. The people who followed the message organized themselves in a certain way. It featured bishops and priests and communities and chief bishops, we call them archbishops, and chief archbishops, we call them patriarchs, and there were 4 patriarchs, all popes. The Patriarch of Alexandria, the Patriarch of Antioch, the Patriarch of Constantinople, and the Patriarch of Rome. And for a period of several centuries, they competed with each other. There were the sacraments. You can't understand the church without the sacraments, because my vision of the church are the thousands and thousands of people who went into the church to this incredible setting and to the celebration of the Eucharist, of the Mass. But there were other powerful sacraments that led you on your road to immortality. Baptism, the confession of sins, penance, the confession of sins and absolution. And then there was the success. The Roman Catholic Church rests on the success of early Christianity. And that success was based not only on the sacraments and the organization and the message, but also the martyrs, whose names are celebrated in the what? The very names of the church. So let me simply ask you a question. Is there anybody in this room prepared to die for his religion? Be prepared to be thrown into a den with, do you understand? With lions. I mean real lions, not the ones at the Detroit Zoo, who yawn when you go there. They're so acculturated to humans watching them. I'm talking about real ones, all right. Or being burned to death or whatever. The success of the church lay in the fact that it had members. All those names attached to all those Catholic churches. Members who were willing to what? Die for the faith. Now, the Roman Catholic Church also rests on what I call certain events, so I have to mention the events because to give you the sense of its success and power. In the 4th century AD, the Emperor of Rome made Christianity the official religion of Rome. And thus he founded the Roman Christian or Catholic Church. Its headquarters in Rome. Christianity was the official religion of the Roman Empire, subsidized by the state, enforced by the state. So in the 4th century AD, it went from being a persecuted religion to a powerful religion with its center in Rome. The second event was the war against the heretics. It's why grand inquisitors were needed. The only way to make the church work was to enforce conformity. And so conformity was enforced. All those who deviated from the official orthodox doctrines of the church were denounced and in many cases killed and in many cases just, expelled. So in the end, whole congregations stood up and recited together. It was the power of the church, the creed. Do you understand the power of that? Everybody. We do that as Americans, although I've noticed people don't stand the way they used to. The Pledge of Allegiance. It's a moment. You all stand, and then we sing, and we sing the song. It's part of our unity. So, the war against the heretics. And then, in 476 AD, Romulus Augustulus, the emperor of Rome, was eliminated. And there was no more emperor in Rome. There was a second emperor in Constantinople, but not in Rome. In Constantinople, the patriarch of Constantinople was under the thumb of the emperor. But in 476, in Rome, no Roman emperor. So in fact, the bishop of Rome, the patriarch of Rome, now rose to become what we call the emperor. He took the place of the emperor who was gone. The next event was the coming of Islam. Hang on to that because that's going to be part of our discussion. In the 8th century or the 7th century AD, the forces of a new religion, Islam, the Muslims, came and invaded Europe. They even took Spain. They crossed the Pyrenees. And in the process, having invaded the Roman Empire, they took both Alexandria in Egypt and Antioch in Syria, and the Muslim armies came to the very gates of Constantinople, the only city in the Christian world that was semi-safe was Rome. It's one of the reasons for the rise to primacy of the Bishop of Rome. And then there was the famous split. There were two patriarchs remaining, one in Constantinople, one in Rome. And then in Constantinople, there occurred a movement in the 8th and 9th century AD called iconoclasm. The Christians in the East, or their leaders, decided to smash all sculpture and destroy all painting, saying that it was inconsistent with Christianity. the people in the West defended painting and sculpture. And the result was a kind of civil war between the two sides that was never healed. Ultimately, the church split in two. The east side became Orthodox, and the west side became Roman Catholic. And then, in the year 800, a German king by the name of Karl, known to us as Charlemagne, arrived in Rome, and the Pope said, if you will defend me and protect me, I will make you the Western Roman Emperor. So he crowned him the Western Roman Emperor and added a title to his name. The old Roman emperors were only Roman emperors. The Pope turned Charlemagne into the what? The Holy Roman Emperor. And then, in the late 10th century, at a monastery in Cluny, in France, there occurred a reform movement. The reform movement sought to turn all priests into celibates. No wives. Now, that did not happen in the Eastern Church. It did happen in the Western Church. And in the Western Church, all priests, all bishops, whatever, must be celibate. The reform of Cluny was adopted by the Pope and by the Roman Catholic Church. And now, this is very important, there became available to the Pope a workforce that had no loyalty except to the church. No loyalty to wife, no loyalty to children. Their entire energy was to God and the church. And then, in the 12th century, the Pope himself organized an army to go and fight Islam. They did not wear any national symbol. They wore the symbol of the church. They wore the cross. They're called the Crusaders. Are you seeing how now the church is what? Growing more powerful, the role of the Pope even more powerful. And then, in 1204, at the beginning of the 13th century, a group of crusaders on their way to the Holy Land to fight the Muslims coming out of Venice turned their course and headed for Constantinople and captured it. And now the church in the East belonged to Rome. And finally, there now arose the figure who represents the church at its greatest height. I've now led you to the church at its greatest height. When did it achieve its greatest height and power? Well, that was in 1215. There was a pope whose name was Innocent III, and he called a council of bishops to his palace in Rome. His palace was not the Vatican Palace. The historic palace of the Pope is the Lateran Palace. To the Lateran Palace, it was called the Lateran Council. But it was the Fourth Council, so it was the Fourth Lateran Council. And in 1215 and 1216, the Pope declared that all kings were subject to his authority. Meaning that the Pope reigned supreme over all the kings of the world, and in fact several of them, including King John of England, who comes out of the Robin Hood story, who was a contemporary of Innocent III, pledged allegiance, which meant the chief ruler of England was the Pope, under him was the king, and then there was the people. By the beginning of the 13th century, this message, this organization, these sacraments had turned into the most powerful religious organization in the world. And it was all reinforced by the fact that hundreds of thousands of men and women chose the religious profession. They were honored to do so. They chose to be priests and nuns. Their parents were happy that they did. And in fact, the Pope had armies, do you understand, of people to do the work of the church. Well, already starting in the 13th century, there were challenges. One of the challenges is that power corrupts. So, it's no secret, even the church will admit it. Many of the people in the church, priests, bishops, leaders, were corrupted by power. And in fact, that stained the reputation of the church and diminished its moral authority. One of the problems of the church that arose in the 13th, 14th, and 15th century was the rise in Europe of nationalism. Nationalism was a function of growing literacy. One of the ways you become aware of your nationality is that you can read and write your language. Oh, French. Oh, German. Oh, Polish. Oh, no, and in fact, that created a problem. The problem was very clear. By the 13th and 14th century, the church had fallen into the hands of the Italians. The Pope was always Italian. No affirmative action. Do you understand? That's all I remember. Popes always spoke what? They were always Italian. Most of the people who ran the organization were what? Italian. Well, if you're a German, think of bread and chocolate. If you're a German in Northern Europe and your economy is improving and now you are developing a case of German nationalism, an organization run by Italians, I mean, they didn't take turns. It wasn't like one Italian pope, one English pope, one German pope, one Portuguese pope, one Spanish. They didn't do that. Today, you'd have to, right? Not then. So, the issue of nationalism was there. In fact, the Pope in the 15th century, when we get to the Borgias, himself becomes a nationalist. He sees himself as the king of Italy. He has armies. He goes out to fight. Is that what the Pope is supposed to do? And then there was urbanization. By the 14th and 15th century, we come into the Renaissance. Western Europe is becoming slightly urbanized. Once you experience city life, then you find alternatives to religion. When you live in a village, just think of it. You live in a village. When the sun rises, you get up and you go out to the field and work. And then when the sun sets, you can't do anything except one thing. Right? You go to bed. The main different activity in your life is religion. There's a church and you go to the what? You go to church, that's where you receive news about what's going on. And in fact, the church is the only splendid place in your area and the whole thing where you find some taste of something different from the tedium of village life. Once you get to the city, The city and the Renaissance now created a group of people whose focus was not so much on the afterlife, but on how to improve their life now. But the biggest challenge was that in the 16th century, the church split in two. I mean, it was an overwhelming challenge because at one time it seemed that over 1/2 of all the Roman Catholics were going to leave the church and become Protestants. And in fact, that would result in 2 centuries of continuous war. Now, the church met the challenge. It met the challenge in 2 ways. So it was an incredible recovery. The first was it organized what is called the Counter-Reformation. The popes reformed themselves, and now they were the moral leaders of a determined church, determined to resist and fight the Protestants. The Pope created a new order for the war against the Protestants. It was called the Jesuits. And the Jesuit order now created an incredible discipline. The church created a new conformity to confront the Protestants. It's called the Catechism, a series of questions and answers that you were supposed to memorize and repeat. And the church now instituted a major inquisition to remove from the church anybody who smacked of rebellion. In addition, at the time of the Reformation, Western European countries went out to conquer the world. The 2 main countries initially that went out to do that were Catholic. They're called Spain and Portugal. And they went out and they conquered half of North America and all of South America and parts of Africa and parts of Asia. And then the church sent thousands and thousands of priests out all over the world to convert the people all over the world. They came to North America, they came to South America, they came to Africa, they came to Asia. They replaced the people they lost in Europe with a new group of people who weren't European. I mean, the center remained in Europe. But now, large numbers of Roman Catholics don't live in Europe. They live what? Outside. And they're not even of European race or of European culture. Now, during the Counter-Reformation, certain countries became intensely Catholic, and in fact, some of us in this room can remember when they were intensely Catholic. It would be inconceivable that the people who lived in this country would ever abandon the Roman Catholic Church. Inconceivable. All right. Spain. Spain was part of the Crusades. Fight the Muslims, kick them out. 1492, Ferdinand and Isabella, the great Spanish Inquisition. A country in which maybe close to 1/4 of the population were either priests or nuns. Even in our day, the victory of Franco, remember, in 1939, allied certainly with the church that had been persecuted by the Republicans, the Loyalists. A regime was established when I first went to Spain. It was the most Catholic country in the world. You walked into church, you couldn't find room. Portugal was taken by Spain, conquered by Spain in 1580, and in fact, the Spanish Inquisition was brought to Portugal. Ultimately, I mean, the Portuguese missionaries were as intensely Catholic as the what? As the Spanish missionaries. and until the middle of the 20th century, Portugal was a country where almost what? Everybody went to church. Italy, the Pope was there. Italy was the homeland, the capital, the center of the Roman Catholic Church. For centuries, it produced most of the popes and the governing bureaucracy of the church. If I went to Sicily or Calabria at the turn of the 20th century, the churches were what? Packed, not just with old people, but with children and young people. The sacraments were indispensable. France was torn by the Reformation, the war between the Catholics and the Huguenots. That was resolved in 1685 when the King of France, the man who founded Detroit, Louis XIV, expelled all the Protestants. Got it? All of them. Expelled. France was to be only a Catholic country. Austria was the part of Germany which championed the Pope against the Protestants and fought wars for almost 200 years against the Germans of the North who were Lutheran. And the wars went on and on. The emperor in Vienna was regarded by the Pope as his chief warrior. And if you go to Vienna, you can see the great buildings of the Jesuits that were what? That were constructed. I mean, Vienna, Austria? Even in the 40s and 50s, the 30s and 40s of this century, it was intensely Catholic. Poland. Oh. The Russians swept in. They were not Catholic. They captured Poland between 1772 and 1795. They took almost all of it. They made it part of the Russian Empire. They took away the secular leaders of the Poles, their kings, whatever it was. Their only leaders were priests. And in fact, the way you showed your Polish patriotism was that you went to church. It was an act of defiance to the Russians. There are very few people I know of in Europe that was more Catholic than the Poles. I mean, thousands of people went into the priesthood and to the nunneries and whatever. In fact, the phrase Polish Protestant seemed like a contradiction in terms. And now the final one, Ireland. Oh. Ireland. Ireland in the 16th century during the Reformation had been conquered by the English. English king after English king sent English armies into Ireland to subdue it. The last one was sent by Betty Davis under Errol Flynn, which is the, He went, she fired him because he wasn't successful, but she found another one who was what? More successful. By the 17th century, the English and the Scottish Protestants were shipping their own people over to Ireland to take all the land. So, the last thing an Irishman would do is become a Protestant. To become a Protestant was to what? Join your enemy. Your enemy were the English and the Scots. Never. So, they lost their secular rulers, their Irish kings. The only rulers they had were the clergy. Is there any people more intensely Roman Catholic than the Irish? When I grew up, the whole church in North America was controlled by the Irish. I always expected either the priest, not just from the movies, the priest or the bishop to be Murphy, O'Reilly. No, that was it. And in fact, Ireland, this little country, produced so many priests that they were shipped all over the world. All over the world. Irish Catholic missionaries. Could anybody ever conceive that the Irish wouldn't go to church? I'm telling you, for my own lifetime. So, what happened? Well, what happened is the enemy that Benedict XVI has identified. The enemy he identified in 3 speeches that I have is called secularism. Now, secularism arose in Europe recently. It's only about 250 to 300 years old. Step 1 of secularism was called the Enlightenment. It was the beginning of the age of science. The first great political event of secularism is called the French Revolution, when the French revolutionaries separated religion from the government, humiliated the Roman Catholic Church, and then sent its armies under Napoleon to conquer all of Europe. The Pope became a prisoner of Napoleon. And the final humiliation was that Napoleon went and decided he wanted to become an emperor himself. So he had a coronation. And he invited the Pope to be present. But to show that under no circumstances was he under any obligation to the Pope or subject to his authority. Does anybody remember the scene? Napoleon took the crown himself and placed it on his head. Let the Pope know his place. What kind of a, So, out of it came a series of doctrines, positions, that were different from any other enemy. The enemy of the Roman Catholics had always been other people who were just as religious, only they disagreed. There were the Greek Orthodox. There were the Jews. There were the Protestants. There were the Muslims. And the church knew how to deal with them. Intensify the faith. Because the enemy also were people of what? Faith. Now, a new enemy had arrived that was totally different from any previous enemy. No faith. Oh. Well, the doctrines, I'll give them to you because they were denounced by the Roman Catholic Church for close to 2 centuries. Skepticism. Skepticism is questioning the truth of the statements in the Bible and in church doctrine. Skepticism is a form of, and I'm not quite sure it's a Roman Catholic word, but it's a form of chutzpah. No. So you're sitting as a kid in the catechism class, and you say something to him, and the kid says, "What? Do you understand?" No, that is. It's like, unacceptable, intolerable. Aren't you going to memorize the question and the answer? The second was the alternative clergy. The age of science, the Enlightenment, the secular age that now emerged in Western Europe and spread all over the world is called globalization, produced this new clergy. First, it produced schools and universities that were secular, that provided secular education and secular teachers. And the top secular teachers are called professors. So now if you want to find out how the world began, you don't call the priest, you call the what? The professor. If you want to find out about healing, you don't call the priest, you call the professor. So now there arrives this alternative clergy. They're still around. So the clergy is now replaced by somebody else, and I've mentioned this on occasion. By 1900, there were many Roman Catholics in a dilemma. If you asked them the question, would you rather have my son the priest or my son the professor? Got it? Things are now changing. The people who are the experts are changing. One of the doctrines was liberalism. Liberalism says not that every person must conform to the doctrines and regulations of the church, but liberalism said every person's in charge of his or her own life, and, you know, everybody makes his or her own choices, and you make your choice, I make my choice, you make your choice, you make your... Chaos, all right, from the perspective of the church, but certainly a doctrine that is now intrinsic even to the American political system. Feminism. In the new urban industrial world that flowed from science, the family has changed. Women receive educations. Women leave the home to go to work. And the birth rate falls. Ooh. Heresy. And then, toward the end of the 19th century, it appeared. Socialism, especially the Marxist variety, that called all religion the opiate of the masses, and now organize what? I mean, groups of people, I mean, thousands and thousands of workers are being indoctrinated at socialist meetings. And all of it is called secularization. What is secularization? Secularization is not hostility to religion, it's simply indifference. That is, people become so busy with alternative activities in a secular society that they simply have no time for religion, and if they wish to defeat death, they go see their doctor and get a pill. So, this enemy, this enemy is powerful. It's not easily defeated. You can't defeat it with an army. You can't send a Catholic army and defeat it because it's a set of ideas. And the set of ideas have their own power because this set of ideas is transforming the world. It's healing people through medicine. It is lengthening their lives. Do you understand? It is producing technology that will change the lifestyle of everybody in the Western world. If the doctrines of the church could do that, see, that's the test. Well, I must say, the reaction to the beginnings of secularism by the church were absolutely negative. the most famous pope of the 19th century was Pius IX. And Pius IX's answer to secularism was to call a council in Rome in 1870 and 71, Vatican Council I. And in Vatican Council I, he announced to the skeptics, when the Pope speaks from his throne, he is infallible. And then there was the rejection of the secularists. Italy was taken over by a bunch of secularists under a king of Italy whose name was Vittorio Emanuele, whose wedding cake monument dominates the center of Rome, and the Pope would have nothing to do with him. He retired to the Vatican, wouldn't talk to them. The whole idea was, we do not talk to these people. Well, the third were the alliances. One of the alliances that the church made at the end of the 19th century was with the army in France against a secular threat. That would produce the Dreyfus trial, in which Alfred Dreyfus, a Jewish officer in the French army, would be falsely convicted of selling military secrets to the Germans, would be humiliated, shipped to Devil's Island, whatever, and then would be exonerated. And France would then be divided between the pro-Dreyfus and the anti-Dreyfus people. The anti-Dreyfus people would come back to power. France, embracing the ideas of the French Revolution, officially became secular. But in World War II, France was defeated by the Germans, and the French got a new government, Maréchal Pétain. And Maréchal Pétain made his alliance with the church, and in fact denounced all these doctrines that I have articulated to you, and said the French Revolution was a disaster. But, of course, Pétain was ultimately defeated. And then there was the politics. There arose a force in Italy that was problematic from the point of view of the church because it wanted to control all education. It was totalitarian. It's called fascism. But the enemy of the church were the socialists and the communists, who were viewed by the church as atheists. Do you make an alliance with the fascists? Well, on the principle of the enemy of my enemy is my friend, Mussolini signed a concordat with the Pope, Pius XI, in 1929, right? That is, the attitude of the church to this assault was, we will fight it in every way that we can. One of the major issues now appeared. In Europe already, the birth rate was falling. So now one of the issues would arise that would become one of the flags of the church in fighting the secular world. It's called birth control. Well, it was all reinforced by something that happened, this reaction. It was reinforced by a revolution that took place in 1917 called the Bolshevik Revolution, when the communists took over Russia. And now the church is terrified. And in fact, it will make an alliance with any anti-communist force that it can find, including the fascists, because it's terrified of this force. In fact, when the war against fascism comes, the church is put in a very difficult place, the Pope. The Pope is Pius XII. Do you repudiate the fascists and embrace the Americans? The Americans are allied to the Russians. But that's resolved after World War II with what? The Cold War. The Americans and Russians fall out with each other, and now America embraces the anti-communist crusade, and now in Europe, the Pope, Pius XII, will organize political parties to fight secularism. The conservative parties in most countries in Western Europe have a name. They're called Christian Democratic. That name was what? Deliberate, indicating that these parties were in favor of the church, and in fact the leaders of these parties were always devout Catholics. But I want to say something. Despite all this work, the church declines. In the 1950s, in France and Germany and Belgium and Austria, church attendance falls. I mean, despite all this effort, whatever is being done doesn't seem to work. The allure, the activities of what we call the new consumer global culture, whatever it was or is, was continuing to win, especially among the young. And already in the 1950s, the recruitment of priests began to decline. I mean, do you understand? It was just small, but you could see the what? It was way up here, and now it's what? It's going down. So, an idea now arose in the church. Maybe fighting it is all wrong. Maybe what we need to do is accommodate ourselves to it. We call it the consumer-friendly approach. No. Now, a man who believed in that was an old man. Pius XII firmly believed in resisting it. But his successor was an old man from Venice. His name was John, and he took the 23rd, all right? The 23rd John, okay. He was so old, most people didn't think he would live through his coronation. No. His coronation is the whole thing, the installation. I mean, you know, pretty old. Although at that time he was younger than I am. But he was supposed to be an interim kind of pope, and then he does something outrageous. Now, it isn't that he did it on his own. This movement had already been moving in the church. Do you understand? How do we stop this decline? And the decline is very easy to determine. It's called declining church attendance. Do you understand? That's very, you don't have to be a genius to figure it out. You just go around and you count 1 week, and then you count a year from then, and whatever else it is. How do we arrest it? Well, people said, the liberals said, you see, you have the wrong tactic. The people come in to the Mass, and they can't understand a word. They don't speak Latin, and the priest has his back to them, and he's mumbling there at the altar, and whatever else it is, it's consumer unfriendly. See, already the vocabulary, if you will, do you understand, of what we call the secular society, it is consumer unfriendly. So, change the language into the vernacular. If you translate it into the language of the country, and they can understand what is going on, then they can get enthusiastic. And then bring in a guitar. Do you be with it. And then turn the priest around. Why should they look at his back? Ironically, in so doing, you have to understand the host that represents God is on the altar. So when the priest turns around to the audience, he's turning his back. No. That's why the back was always to the what? To the audience, and the front to the altar. God, everybody is facing God. But now this new consumer-friendly society, the priest what? Turns around. So now you got to hire interior decorators, architects. They got to redesign. No, you've seen it. Like the altar has to be pushed forward, and what kind of chairs, and where do they sit, and whatever. I hate to confess this. Some people look better from the back than they do from the front. But I didn't say that, did I? All right, fine. So, do you understand this consumer friendly? So, but that was, and it seemed, yeah, that's it. If we do that, then they'll what? They'll come in music and the little language and what we call a friendly priest who stands facing you and talking to you. Oh. So that was Vatican Council II. John the 23rd bought the argument. And then they said, the other thing we have to do is we're now living in an urban society of mixed populations. So you can't, and all kinds of people are invited to weddings and things like that. You can't have the priest get up and say, Protestants are heretics. The groom may be a Protestant. I mean, you can't talk. Do you understand? It's not nice. So what we need is a little what? Understanding, toleration, acceptance, the whole thing. So out of Vatican Council II, it all came. What came was toleration. We fought all these wars against the religious enemy, and now you're saying, well, if you want to be Jewish, it's okay. If you want to be Protestant, I guess it's okay. If you want to be Muslim, I guess it's okay. Now remember, I know it's hard for you, but if we want to get those people through the door, so they went, and not only did they introduce toleration, they introduced liberalism. Liberalism is expressed in an idea that came out of Vatican Council II called conscience. It says that when you are trying to figure out what you should do or not do, you not only consult the Pope, you consult your conscience. So what if my conscience doesn't agree with the Pope? So that's where you get all these liberal Catholics who say, I'll choose point 1, point 3, point 5, point 9. I don't like 2, say whatever. I mean, what are we talking about? But the idea was, if we only do that, then all these people who come in and they don't like this environment anymore, do this, do that, do this, do that. Check your conscience. It's a revolution. So now the test of it, you see, the test of it is, will the decline stop? And will people start coming back? I mean, it's a clear test. You don't have to be, again, a genius. You just have to stand at the door with a little counter. Well, it's the great reversal. Pius XII would have torn out whatever hair was left on his head. I mean, whatever. Do you understand? The Counter-Reformation, all this effort. Cardinal Spellman in New York would have had a second coronary. I mean, so it's done. So what's the consequence? We now have the priest looking around. We now have all the people understanding the language. By the way, there is an advantage to a language you can't understand. Because if there are controversial things that are being said, and you can't understand, and you can't understand them, then they're acceptable. Once you translate, this was a problem. There's a movement in Judaism called the Reform Movement, and they thought if they translated the prayers into English, they'd be more acceptable. That was the problem. Once, that is, there's a danger. There's something, some people like magical languages that they don't understand that are sort of mysterious, you know, the whole thing. And in fact, it sort of fits into where they're. So they did all of that. They got the guitars and the whole thing, whatever. You know, one of the reasons I'm into public speaking is I flunked the guitar course at the seminary. I can't do that one. All right, so they got it all. What's happened? The attendance is plummeting. So now you can hear the other side. We told you so. You try to accommodate yourself. You try to be consumer friendly. You undermine the fundamental doctrines of the church, and what are you getting? Nothing. Failure. I mean, the most liberal areas of the Roman Catholic Church that love Vatican Council II. Holland and Belgium. Holland is a Protestant country, but almost half the people are nominally Catholic. Belgium is what? Totally Catholic. You go to the churches in Holland and Belgium. They got guitars out of the gazoo. They got what I call friendly clergy facing the what? The congregation. It doesn't mean that what is being done is not right. What it means is it's not working to achieve the goal that they wanted. Because in Europe, the rate of defection is expanding. I mean, accelerating, I should say. So that's the question. They tried plan A. They tried plan not A. No, got it? And both plans have led to the same result. Only plan not A, it's even gotten worse. So that raises the question. What can the church do? Do you understand? To reverse this trend, because without any congregation, you don't have to worry about getting any priests. And this is happening in the homeland of the Christian church, of the Roman Catholic Church. It's Europe. In fact, if you go to Spain now, Spain has the lowest birth rate in Europe. Italy has one of the lowest birth rates in, believable? In Europe. Got the question? Is there anything the church can do to reverse the trend? Well, if you come back in 5 minutes, I'll tell you what it can do. Thank you very, very much.
Why do they call it a funny bone?
Why can't penguins fly? Like a sea safety.
Can we go to the moon on vacation?
If you think it's tough answering these questions, imagine the ones you'll get if your child is diagnosed with cancer. CureSearch.org can help. It's run by doctors and scientists whose research has led to an overall cure rate of 78%. You're not as alone as you feel.
Let me tell you about how the situation has worsened for the church. Now, there was an area of the church, while Western Europe, despite all the changes, was featuring declining attendances. I mean, not just minor change, dramatic changes. In Eastern Europe, the church was very successful. And I can attest to that because I was in Poland before the fall of communism. Now, John Paul II, Karol Wojtyła, came from Poland. And the church he experienced was a very intense one, and I'll explain why. In Eastern Europe, in the countries that were Catholic, Poland, Lithuania, to some degree in Hungary, but mainly Poland and Lithuania. The countries were under communist rule. And the people hated the communists. It was a repressive, horrible regime, and the economy was rotten. And when they went to school, they were told by their teachers, communist or otherwise, that religion was terrible and that the Catholic Church was horrible. So, since they hated the communists made religion attractive. So the way you showed resistance to communism, because the communists didn't allow any other organizations to exist except the church. They were going to close down the church as they had done it for all practical purposes in Russia. But in 1956, a rebellion occurred in Poland, led by a communist by the name of Gomulka. Khrushchev actually came to Poland, and a deal was made between Gomulka and Khrushchev that the Russians would allow the Poles to reopen their churches. Not their schools, but their what? Their churches. So churches existed in Poland. They were vital institutions, and they were the centers of Polish nationalism. Even if you weren't religious, just to show the communists how you didn't like them. Do you understand? You went there. Even some Jews went to church. During the Solidarity period, there weren't many Jews left in Poland, but there were a few young Jews, some of them people who discovered their Jewish origins late in life, or later in life. They went to the church because the church was the place of resistance against the communist regime. So ironically, the church needed the communists. If communism was still in charge of Poland, the churches would be what? Filled. You know, I mean, we have these strange relationships. I think I've made reference to it before. I knew a couple that was always hollering at each other, and then one of them died. And then the other became depressed because there was nobody to holler at. no, ultimately, your best skill becomes hollering, so now you can't use it anymore. It's a source of depression. Okay, so ironically, you become dependent on your enemy. So the church said, we'd love the communists to fall. And in fact, one of the reasons why communism fell in Poland and Eastern Europe was that Karol Wojtyła, the Pope, John Paul II, came to visit in Poland. He helped to mobilize Polish nationalism against the communists. And communism fell. Well, now the communists are gone. The communists were the people who were always telling you what to do. So now the roles are reversed. The consumer culture enters into Poland. Everybody is into doing his own, her own thing, at least in the cities. And now the organization that's telling people what to do or not to do is the church. The role has changed. Now, for instance, under communism, abortion was allowed in Poland. So now the war with the communists is over. The Communist Party's gone. So Polish women were simply accustomed to choosing abortion when they wanted it. Now the church chimes in. Now the women who went to church because they hated the communists, now they hate the church. Life is filled with such ironies, I cannot tell you. So the roles are reversed. The church needed communism. Had communism remained in Eastern Europe, the Roman Catholic Church in Eastern Europe would have been what? Strong. Once it fell, there's all this discontent. Why don't they stop preaching? Why don't they stop trying to control our lives? So, after the fall of communism, church attendance began to decline. The same thing is true in Lithuania. There was an initial spurt. Now, Poland has far more people than France, percentage-wise. But given where it was, it's now on the way what? Down, it's shrinking. So the fall of communism has aggravated the condition of the church. It has spread the consumer culture and globalization into Eastern Europe, and that's the death knell. So let me tell you about the realities. Spain, and it happened so fast because Franco didn't fall until 1975. That's pretty fast. Although for somebody who's 30 years old, it's not so fast. But for me, it's for me, given the history of the church, fast. Nobody goes. I'm in Zapatero's government now in Spain. Does anybody go to church? It's a socialist party, but whatever. Nobody. Not there. Italy. I may have mentioned this. Now, the birth rate is so terrible in Italy. There are no bambini. There's just no bambini. You see children, but they're generally the children of immigrants, Albanians, Muslims, whatever. No, there are no bambini. In Genoa, the average age of the native Italian is 50. The schools are overwhelmingly filled with non-Italian kids, and half of them can't speak Italian. So that's all this falling birth rate. And it's all related to Italy moved from the work culture to the leisure culture. In Italy, for a while, I don't think they allow it anymore, you could retire at 50 with a pension. And I know certain people in Italy who retired at 50, they're now 93. And the state has been paying, do you understand? The state has been paying their pension for 43 years. Okay. Leisure culture, go to the beach, cook, whatever, the whole thing. Bambini. So there's no doubt about it. The consumer culture and what I would call the full global culture always suppresses the birth rate, just brings it down, and so down. So the number of Catholics is being reduced not only by deliberate choice, but also by no babies. All right, fine. There's one country where they're going to church. I know, Ireland. Well, Ireland has now arrived into the global culture. It's one of the most prosperous countries in Europe. People are going from all the countries of Europe into Ireland to find jobs. It started with cheap labor, and the resistance to the church was also triggered by the terrible sexual scandals that occurred not only in North America, but also occurred in Europe. Dublin is one of the funnest cities in the world. Great for travel, great for entertainment, great for music, and it's great for photographing empty churches. And it happened, I want to tell you, we're talking about 15 years. Don't underestimate the power of the global, do you understand? Of the global culture. It entered into Ireland, it has transformed Ireland. They now have alternative activities. It's not that they hate the church, they just don't have time for it. You know, we're all busy, aren't we? Once you enter the global culture, you have schedules. What do I do from 12 to 12:15? What do I do from 12:15 to 12:20? What do I do from 12:20 to 12:40? You know, the whole thing. I'm busy. So it's Ireland. Unbelievable. I can go down all the, France already for sure. Austria? Down. So Hungary? Down. It's always so interesting that if we want to find out what the people are doing, we always come with our cameras and go to the churches, don't we? Because the buildings are left from, these magnificent buildings left from the past. All right. Well, the church now has these incredible problems. So now you want to respond. Okay, what we're going to do is we're going to train a new kind of priest. This priest is going to be a with-it priest, but it's also going to be a little more traditional. You know, whatever. They're not quite sure what to do. It doesn't make any difference. They now have no troops to send out to change anything. That even if they had a plan, there's nobody to ship out. In Europe, the recruitment of priests and nuns is way, way down. Can't find them. The only way you can function is you have to import priests from the part of the Catholic world that is still religious. That's Africa, Asia, Latin America. But even Latin America is experiencing a priest shortage. Well, there's the divided laity. So now it is that you walk into the church and you issue the decree. On one side are the liberals, on the other side are the what? The traditionalists, and they're arguing with each other ever since Vatican Council II. The third, which infuriates the Pope, and may be responsible for one of his remarks, The only people left in Europe that are religious are Muslims. Because the birth rate is so terrible, they're being imported to do what? Menial work. They stay, and they have a high birth rate, and they are intensely religious. So the Pope is a little nervous about that, right? Which is the enemy, the Muslims or the secularists? And the revenues of the church are declining. You've got all these buildings, the structures. I just noticed in Southfield they have sold St. Bede, right? You're going to tear it down. There's going to be a shopping center or something on the corner. The last Mass is June the 24th. I read the sign as I was driving by. All right. And then you've got the disgruntled third world. The disgruntled third world are all these people in central Nigeria, northern Zambia, who were converted by missionaries to Catholics, and they are very what? Catholic. You go to that church in Zambia, they show up what? Every Sunday, everybody together. Old people, middle people, young people, they're all there. And they sing their hymn, whatever else it is, and they are devout Catholics. Pius XII would love them. And their leaders and they are sick and tired of a church that has its headquarters in the midst of Sodom and Gomorrah. I mean, that's what it is. I mean, from the traditional point of view, that's what Europe is it not? So, what are the implications? I hate to tell you this, I don't have a plan for the Pope. Because I don't know sociologically how to reverse it. The way to reverse it would be for all the Italians, Spanish, Portuguese, whatever, the French, to repudiate the consumer culture and the global economy, to move back to small villages and do subsistence farming. Got it? You got the solution? You thought I didn't have one. I have one. No, it's a solution, is it not? You offer it. If they did that, their birth rate would soar. The attendance in the church would what? Would soar. All right. The second is that the Muslim presence in Europe is only going to increase, and the Muslim presence is overwhelmingly religious. So the irony of the history of Europe is that the most religious group in Europe now, it's true, are the Muslims. The Catholics, if you ask this person on the beach on Sunday morning in Spain, are you Catholic? Yes, of course they're Catholic. So what does that have to do with my being on the beach? No, of course, everybody has to have a label, right? You ask, what are you? You got to have a what are you, right? What are you? So, yeah, I got a name. They just totally, it's not hostility, it's indifference. So is that an irony that the Muslim religion is the most, the third is there's going to be sporadic resistance. And now in Poland, we have twins. One's the president. I call them the Kaczynski twins. One's the president, one's the prime minister. And what they want to do is to restore the church. So they've passed certain laws, whatever. It's not going to make any difference. These two people aren't going to be able to change anything. And then the final consequence of the whole thing is, it's going to happen in the 21st century. There's going to be a fundamental shift in the church from Europe, the homeland of the Roman Catholic Church, to Africa and Asia and even Latin America. In fact, the next pope could be black. or Asian, because I'm telling you, there are millions and millions. I mean, there are 900 million people in the world who claim to be Roman Catholic, and maybe 1/3 of them are to be found in Europe, but the other 2/3 aren't there, and they're not part of the new global culture that's sweeping Rome, Paris, and whatever else it is. They're living in villages somewhere in Africa and Asia, and in fact the doctrines of the church are very appealing to them, and the path of the defeat of death is very attractive to them. Do you understand? And their children may become priests. I call it the Great Shift. The center of the church, I mean, the headquarters will always remain Rome. It's like General Motors, it's downtown. No, the people are out there, so the headquarters will remain. But the Roman Catholic Church is going to be a church with its headquarters in Rome, but its heart in other continents. And then the issue is, when the global culture finally arrives there, in 50 years, 100 years, I don't know how long it's going to take, what then will happen? I do not know, but you've been a wonderful audience, and thank you so much for coming.
In the global culture